Hello, and thank you for joining us. The name of this program is Straight Talk, a public affairs discussion sponsored by the Midland Cultural Center. My name is Doug Mond, and I'm the moderator of Straight Talk. We're pleased to acknowledge and thank our season sponsor, Brampton Brick, for their generous support of this show and all MCC programming. Our topic today is a new future for small towns. Now, whether you are a newcomer to areas like ours, or whether you've been lucky enough to live your whole life in a small town rural area, many of us feel that living in a smaller place fosters a sense of community, a special feeling of community. I probably at this point should cue up John Mellencamp, who wrote a well-known rock ballad about this feeling of his love for small town living, but I won't do that. It's fair to say, however, that many small towns at this point in their time are worried about their future. Many have experienced declining economies, the youth migration to the cities, and aging populations. There are inevitable severe budget pressures, fiscal challenges, and COVID has, as it always does, complicated their life in recent years. So among the questions I think we need to ask today is, how can small towns and rural communities still maintain the community lifestyle, which makes them such a great place to live, and still be sustainable? So how can they thrive in the current environment? Now, the future is not certainly all doom and gloom. Some small towns, in fact, have done very well. For example, those towns close to urban areas who have succeeded by catering to urban visitors and also attracting residents who are prepared to commute to their jobs. Newcomers who seek out the benefits of city amenities in a small town rural setting. Is this the new small town formula? And is there a cost to this approach if it is? And finally, inevitably, has COVID, which has brought on so many social changes, recalibrated this for small towns as well? Or maybe has it created opportunities? This and many things we will talk about today. So we're very fortunate to welcome our panel here, and I thank them very much for their willingness to come on board and talk about these issues. And these folks think a great deal about these questions, but from different perspectives. And all of them are equally passionate about the future of our small town rural communities. So I'm pleased to introduce them now. First of all, Mayor Brian Saunderson. Brian, nice to see you. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, Doug. Good to be here.
We're glad you're with us. Now, Brian was elected mayor of Collingwood in 2018 after serving a term as deputy mayor for 4 years. He has enjoyed a varied and distinguished career as a lawyer, a teacher, and a community volunteer. Brian's a great believer in the power of the individual in our communities to make a difference. Brian, I was very interested to learn that you were a member of Canada's Olympic rowing team and in fact are a 2-time silver medalist. Brian, I can't imagine a more useful skill for a municipal mayor than competitive rowing. So,
well, it certainly it got me into the legal profession because after you've been rowing backwards for many decades, going into law where you sit on your butt and look backwards, it's the perfect subject.
Well, I'm in conflict, so I can't comment. Anyway, thanks so much, Brian. I'd like to introduce next Ashley Whedon. Hi, Ashley. Ashley Whedon is an award-winning rural futurist and researcher. She holds a BA in International Development, Master of Public Admin, and she's currently just completing her PhD in Rural Studies at the University of Guelph. Ashley is known to be a longtime advocate for community engagement in public policy and locally led innovation. And her research has contributed significantly to a growing body of research and advocacy on rural revitalization. So welcome, Ashley, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, our last guest is Doug Ewen. Hi, Doug.
Hey, Douglas.
Doug has many years of experience as a corporate executive in the manufacturing sector and currently serves as a vice president in a division of Magna Closures. He holds degrees in communications and human resources and is a certified human resources professional. At the present time, Doug serves as a community member of the Economic Development Association of North Simcoe, which began as a citizens advisory group, I understand. So thank you for being here, Doug.
Thanks for having me.
So you will see from what I've just told you that our guests certainly have a wide range of experience and investment in small town issues. And I'm really looking forward to what they have to say in this show. So what I want to ask them, first of all, is to say a few words about their own personal focus and their own concerns about the challenges facing small town rural. And I'd like to begin with Mayor Saunderson, if I could.
Thank you, Doug. And I think I would say I'm quite encouraged to hear about the municipal dialogue. And when I got into municipal politics, I was concerned that our community didn't have a plan. And I think community-based strategic plans are critical in mapping your way forward. It's the type of sort of aspirational dialogue that you need to have with your community members to find out how they see your community, its current state, the challenges it faces, and what they'd like to see happen moving forward. And that really is the roadmap for council. It's the lens that you look through when you're evaluating any initiative or budget item. How does it move the ball forward? And so when I got into politics, the famous saying, fail to plan, plan to fail, was a big part of my campaign at that point in time. And so in 2015, the town of Collingwood went through a community-based strategic plan, and we did it again in 2019 after the last election to refresh that and have that discussion with our public. And I guess one thing that really struck me when we went through that process is that there's really 4 pillars that are critical to the sustainability and the health of your community, and that's the economic, cultural, social, and environmental. And as I've been in this chair for the last 3 years, it occurs to me that these 4 pillars are really the social determinants of public health for a municipality. In other words, they're the indices. They tell you the health and well-being and sustainability of your community. How are you faring in each of those 4 items? And so, I think we are in a point in time where there has certainly been a great deal of stress over the last 20 months with the pandemic. But at every point in history, municipalities have been faced with changes, and the planning process to me is critical in how you go forward, how you move forward. And the other saying to me that's equally critical is, what gets measured gets done. And so when you set out that roadmap, you have to have benchmarks, you have to have ways that you can hold yourself accountable. Are you achieving the things that you've agreed with your municipality to do? And how have you advanced the ball? And so annually, we go through a process at the council table where staff come back and report to us on how we are doing on those critical items under each of those 4 pillars. So we are certainly in a very different transition, I think, across Ontario and certainly in Simcoe County. But like any challenge and any future, you've got a plan for it. And you have to assess the challenges that you're facing and then move forward with that in mind, having measurables that you can look at the impacts of what you're doing to make sure that you are addressing those issues. But we are facing some longstanding issues and also some new issues that have been brought forward. And I would think everything has been exacerbated by the pandemic, from labor shortages, housing crisis, rising costs with inflation. There's a lot of things that are moving parts that are affecting certainly the discussions around the council table and the boots on the ground day-to-day life of our residents.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian. There's so much we wanted to cover in our discussion today. I certainly want to hear about the Collingwood experience when we get a little into this discussion. Things that have you think, gone right, markers for success, things that maybe didn't go as well as you hoped, or unexpected problems. So Collingwood's experience, I think, will be very illustrative. So thank you for that. So can I call on you, Ashley, to give us your point of view on this very broad topic that I'm introducing?
Yeah, and I mean, as somebody that does rural studies for a profession, as it were, we can even start with, what's rural. As I think a fair number of people in my profession, we spend a lot of our time kind of arguing over what constitutes rurality. And I'm far more interested in place than I am rural versus urban, and because places matter, right? I think we're joining from various places virtually, and this is wonderful what it's enabled. But at the end of the day, place still matters, right? Places where services are delivered or not delivered, they are where governance happens or doesn't happen. It's where our identities are formed. It's where we develop our sense of self and our sense of belonging. And whether through accident, in terms of it's somewhere you were born and have stayed, or somewhere that you've chosen on purpose, place matters to us. And so what really matters to me in the discussion moving forward is that we really drill down from this sort of view of rural as a monolith, right? As something that there is a singular rural. Well, there isn't, because just like Montreal, Toronto, Berlin, Amsterdam, Barcelona are all very different cities. And we sort of take that for granted, that the urban identity will be different in different cities. We tend to reduce rural, remote, First Nations all to one word in Canadian public policy and framing. So we say rural, remote, First Nations as if they're all the same. And we know not only is there a massive difference between rural and First Nations experiences, but between rural and remote, and even rural and remote and northern experiences. And so it's really important that we dig down into the fact that while we may be facing similar challenges, we're all in really kind of different places as shaped by place, right?
Right.
By the qualities of where we're at. And so just to sort of respond to sort of what Brian was saying and what I've seen come up in a lot of things is, one, we need to combat the myth that rural decline is inevitable. So rural growth is actually happening. It's just unevenly distributed. So rural places in Canada represent almost 20% of the national population, but we contribute just under a quarter of the national gross domestic product. There we go. So out punching ourselves in terms of our size and our contributions. We're important sites of food production, energy production, managing climate change. But what I want to move away from is this idea that rural places are valuable only in what they can provide or what can be extracted. Rural places are valuable and worthy in and of themselves. And so what's coming in the future for me is this idea that what happens when we change this narrative to build on what brilliant colleagues of mine in Nova Scotia, Karen Foster, talks about, the right to be rural. When we start talking about this through a rights-based lens in terms of, do you have what you need to build a meaningful life and livelihood, that changes the conversation in terms of looking at investment. And so while I love the sort of the phrases around, if you don't measure it, it doesn't count. Not everything that gets measured counts either, right? So there's a difference between building the machine right and building the right machine. And this is something that rural communities really need to start looking into from a municipal perspective, from business, from everything else, is, are we pursuing strategies and goals that actually matter to our unique place, or are we chasing an urbanized notion of what innovation looks like, of what rural development should look like, of what we should be doing? And instead of turning inward and thinking, what are the investments we need to make in our communities? Arguably, the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, disasters are not new. They're just exacerbating what we've known for decades, versus we've maybe rested on our laurels a little too long when it comes to managing infrastructure, looking at how we're going to actually build our futures in a very physical sense. And we need to sort of start taking stock of what it's going to cost to come up with that initiative to make up for that lack of investment over the last 30 to 40 years. And secondly is this idea around self-determination and autonomy and accountability and authority. And so, you phrased it around municipalities being creatures of the province. And I think that there's nothing more frustrating than people with power claiming that they don't have any. And municipalities have tremendous amounts of power to continue moving the narrative forward. So if we're going to actually build that future, we really need to start looking inward around what we can meaningfully do in our communities and stop blaming Parliament Hill, stop blaming Queen's Park, and actually look at the things that we're doing on our side of the street around how we're investing in our futures. And then the last thing I want to say is, it's not lost on me that you have three very white faces on this panel tonight. I'm probably the youngest. I'm certain I identify as a woman, but I'm still an upper middle class white lady. And my experiences are going to be very different than new Canadians, than a person of color in a rural community, than refugees coming to this country, than someone who may be queer or different in some way than this sort of prescriptive model. And so we have to start widening this lens to the true reality of rural experience for different types of people and really explore what that means moving forward. So this idea around the right to be rural, investing in our futures, and then really thinking, who is it for and why is it for them, right? In terms of how we move forward.
Well, I hope to deal with many of those points, Ashley. I mean, one of the things that's interesting with this migration, some say it's a reverse migration from the GTA and urban centers, is that it's bringing with it demographic changes. I hail from Dufferin County, where I spent most of my adult life. It's a dramatic change in little places like Shelburne in terms of recently arrived Canadians, different ethnicities. And it's having a really interesting impact. And the communities are absorbing that and dealing with it, but it's a bit of a shock to some of the residents in terms of, we didn't expect this. And I think that's all part of the panoply, you know? So maybe we could touch on that a little bit when we get further into this, okay? Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, Ashley. So Doug Ewen, what's your take on this topic generally, and what's important to you?
Well, I'm going to take a little bit more of a personal point of view on this, actually, because I have spent most of my life in a small town. I grew up in Parry Sound. From the time I was 4 years old up until I went away to school, I spent a little bit of time in Waterloo and a little bit of time in Brampton before we moved up here to Midland. So for me, this is a very personal topic because I with my wife back in 1990, we made a decision that we wanted to leave the city. We wanted to raise our kids in a small town or a smallish town, smaller city. We wanted to raise our kids there because we had experiences with that growing up. And we wanted to have our kids have that experience as well. And a big part of that, frankly, was our desire to both be able to parent our kids equally, to be able to go to the school and see them doing their things, and to be able to do that. If I have an hour commute, which I had in Toronto, if I had an hour commute, that kind of thing was not necessarily realistic. But up here, my commute is 7 minutes. So it's a lot easier to participate in the community and in the lifestyle and have a certain approach with my family. When I was in Parry Sound, I saw companies close and I saw friends leave. It didn't really strike me too much at the time, of course, because I'm young and I had other concerns. But when we moved to Midland, I saw more of the same. I saw more people leaving and more companies closing, more manufacturers closing. I was in a position with the company I'm at. I was in a position to influence that and to help maintain that, because I recognize the economic impact that these companies have, and not just the direct impact. There's payroll that goes out to their employees, and that money gets spent in the community, in the different stores, in the different areas, in the different festivals and things that happen through the community. Within the company, we use other companies to come in and help service and use things or repair things that we have. So, the economic impact of the company I work for within this community can be counted in the tens of millions of dollars. And if the community can't support the company, or the company can't be successful in the community, it's a dramatic impact on people in town, not just direct employees, but indirect as well. So I recognize that when I'm in a small town working on behalf of companies to help them be healthy, to help them grow where they can, is going to be good for the community overall, including good for my company. It's good to have other companies in as well, because we can provide wages to people. We can provide the opportunities to people. We can provide that chance to live here. I've had that chance. Over the 30 years I've been in Midland, my company has put food on my table. It's helped me put my kids through school. It's allowed me to be part of raising my kids in this community. And that's very important and very personal to me. So when we talk about, the future of small towns, this is not a new conversation. This conversation was going on, 40 years ago in Parry Sound. This conversation, I'm sure, is still going on today in Parry Sound. It's going on in Midland, Penetang, Tiny, and Tay, where I am. Brian, I'm sure it's going on in Collingwood. And it will continue to go on. But it's having these conversations, and it's finding the positivity to drive forward. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is, frankly, our own population. Our own population does not see and understand and realize the success that is in the community now. Going to a point that Ashley made about diversity, I think increasing diversity is a fantastic thing. We see a little bit of that happening in our area right now. I would love to see more and see that encouraged and grow more so that we can see there's so many positives that we have in our community that we can seize on and continue to seize on. But we all tend to go on to the negative side and look at, some youth leaving, and that is true, but there's some youth that are staying. How do we encourage that more? But more importantly, how do we encourage people to circle back? So if you leave, that's a good thing. Go and experience, go and see, go and learn, understand what's happening in other areas, and eventually circle back and bring your family or bring yourself back into this area. So I think there's a lot of positive things that I see, and a lot of things that pull me into things like economic development. Because I think, when you look at your community, there's a lot of positives that are happening that we all tend to overlook. And I think we need to stop. You need to look and be and deal with the negative, but you also need to focus and seize on the positive and help people see that as well.
Okay. Well, all interesting points of departure. So I wonder, some of you already touched on it, but just starting at the beginning, sort of the myth versus the reality. What makes a small town a small town? Anybody want to comment on that? Like, why is this important? It must be important, or we wouldn't be talking about it. So, what do you think, Brian? I mean, did you grow up in a city or a small town?
I grew up in Toronto, but I was very fortunate. When I was 4 years old, my parents bought an old schoolhouse on the 10th concession just outside of Collingwood in Ottawa. And so Collingwood's been a second home for me. My wife and I were married on the Ball Diamond at the schoolhouse in 1990. And similar to Doug, I started my law career in Ottawa, and we lived in Chelsea, Quebec, which was very rural. And then we wanted to sort of merge the work environment and home environment. So we moved with our three boys, who were 7, 5, and 3 at the time, to come to Collingwood to raise them here. And it was the best decision we ever made. I guess to go to your question, though, I think it's constantly evolving. I think one of the wonderful attractions to a small town is that you have the commutes are less. You're right immersed in the environment that you're living in, and there's a real sense of community. I think that sense of community exists in Toronto, but it's more on a neighborhood basis than a townwide basis. And I think that, to Doug's point about the evolution of the economy, certainly in Collingwood, we have seen that in spades. We were very much a single industry based community with shipbuilding for the last 100 years prior to the 1980s. And in 1986, it shut the doors. And that was a dramatic impact for our community, which affected us massively economically, but I think also socially and environmentally. And we've really rebuilt ourselves from that and gone through a transition to the point that I think about 6 years ago, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, when they started measuring entrepreneurism in communities, ranked Collingwood one of the top 10 communities of any size in Canada for entrepreneurism, because after the shipyards closed, if you wanted to stay here, which many did because this was their community and their home, they had to make their own jobs. So today we have a very diverse economy here. We have Pilkington and Canada Mist, which are large employers, some boutique manufacturing like Agnora Glass and McLean Engineering, who have been here for a long time. And now we're getting into the tech sector, so the gray matter economy. So I think we can retain our small town feel and we can evolve at the same time. It goes to Ashley's point about us not being monolithic. There are very real differences between all small communities. But I think what unites, I think the common factor is that sense of belonging, that smaller community feel, that ability to go down the street and say hello to the majority of the people, to go to the rink and watch kids play hockey, and go to the school and see the events, and to have a satisfying work-life balance. I think it is evolving. It will continue to evolve, but I do believe that we can retain that small town feel, but certainly with growth pressures. And just looking at Simcoe County, we're going through the municipal comprehensive review that will look at growth targets or allocations in our various communities. And that is a process that, from a municipal perspective is very critical, because it will drive your growth planning, your official plan, your infrastructure demands, your traffic demands. It's very critical to the complexion of the community, these impacts of growth and the targets that are set as the municipalities or the large urban centers continue to grow.
So Ashley, what do you think about what Brian's just told us? And what's your sense of what makes a small town a small town?
All right, so I'm gonna defer to my academic training on this at least, and then I'll also talk a little bit about my experiential beliefs on that from having worked in local government for most of my career in rural context. So the first one is, we wanted just a pure definition of what rural is. We can use Ray Bowman, who was the former head of Statistic Canada's Rural Bureau, uses this idea that rurality is a spatial concept. So it is a function of low density and high distance to density. So if we want to get down to sort of what rural is classified in terms of policy and funding decisions, it's always about the degree of density and how far away you are from centers of density. That's the sort of a very, cut and dry notion of rurality. And Ray's argument, and I adore Ray, and for those of you that are more interested in rural research in particular, please do check out his work for the Rural Ontario Institute. But Ray would tell you that whatever then you find in a place that's low density and high distance from density is a characteristic of that place, not necessarily a function of rurality. Rurality is spatial, everything else is social. In experience and in terms of how we do these things, it's almost always relation, right? So I would not classify Collingwood as rural or a small town in my experience. I would not classify Orangeville or Shelburne in the same category either. For me, rural is somewhere far smaller. And this is a function of where I grew up, where I've worked, where I've spent most of my career. Internationally, this is also the case, right? What is considered rural in parts of Asia would be considered a massive municipality in North America. What's rural in Europe and the kinds of agriculture and functions of rurality that happen there are far different than what happened here. So in practice, while we might have this very cut and dry notion of what is rural, in application, we see that it's almost always contextual. So this is why this notion of place or how we talk about ourselves, it's not static, right? It's not removed and in a vacuum. It's always in relationship to other things, other places, other people. And that's how we define ourselves. The same way as like identity, right? So when I'm here in Canada, depending on who I'm talking to, I'm from Ontario and I'm from, Grey Bruce and all these kinds of things. But when I'm talking to people that are more local to me, we live on the old Royacker farm because property in a rural area is transitive. It's not yours until you leave it. And so this idea that it will become the Whedon farm when we leave it is part of that ideal. Or I'm, Jim and Marjorie's daughter, I'm Ralph Kent's granddaughter, all of these kinds of things that attach you to a place in people's mind. In practice, I'll give you an example of what this looked and felt like for me when I started with Grey County. And we led their Connected County initiative and a number of really forward-thinking projects that led us to doing exactly what you were talking about, Doug, telling different stories about what happens in rural places that led to the recognition of Grey County as one of the top 7 intelligent communities in the world in 2017. Part of that storytelling started with my own storytelling, right? It was my first day on the job, and our warden at the time said, Whedon, would you be related to the Chatsworth Whedon? Well, my family last name had been on the side of a mill for generations, even though I had been working in the city of London and they had brought me up. And so everyone assumed I was this kid from away from the city that didn't have any contextual factors. But what that did is it gave me a buy. So all of a sudden, I now had legibility in a region for people because I was perceived as being of that place. And so this is a double-edged sword in terms of that sense of belonging that you were talking about, Brian, as being associated with rurality, because that sense of belonging can then become almost so highly guarded and proprietary that we don't release it to anyone else. No one else has a claim to that sense of belonging. And we saw that through the pandemic in terms of, do people with a second property have the right to access that when there are travel restrictions? Are they part of the community or not? How do you determine what that sense of belonging and who gets to claim that right to being rural in terms of who belongs there? And then tying that into also, if we want to look at the functionality of rurality in terms of what happens in rural places. So there's a lot of innovation, exactly as you said, Doug, around things that happen because of rurality, not despite it. So if we want to look at nuclear energy around certain forms of manufacturing, agriculture, wind production, climate sinks, anything related to doing to large-scale transportation hubs on the Great Lakes or through massive ports, almost all of that happens in rural context because you're not really going to see a large-scale nuclear reactor in the middle of downtown Toronto, right? But this has policy implications as well, because the people that are making decisions about, we saw this with wind turbines. Well, that's not going to bother anyone because they're out in a rural place. Those people don't have to live next to one, which is a totally different experience, right? Yeah. So all of this starts to get wrapped up in itself in terms of, is rurality a function of just space? Is it a function of identity? Is it a function of economy? And arguably in my work, I talk about it's a function of all three. It's this layered experience of identity, networks and context, and then those geospatial realities in terms of what shapes that. And that functions to shape all of our conceptions of rural.
Okay. All right. So it gets broader and broader.
Yeah. If I could just jump in quickly.
Yeah, by all means.
To pick up on a point Ashley's been making. So rurality and small towns, there is a distinction. And it's certainly the UN habitat, they consider a small town being a population of under 50,000. And if we consider the makeup of Ontario, of the 444 municipalities we have, 75% of the population probably lives in less than 20% of those municipalities. So that means that 20% of our population, or 25% of our population lives in 80% of the municipalities that occupy the majority of the landmass of the province. They'll be distinguished between rural in the sense of spatial and then other communities. Like Collingwood, I agree. We have a very defined settlement boundary here, and we have one organic farm in town, but very little farmland as compared to Clearview or Oro-Medonte. So, but I still consider us a small town, and I think the small towns play a very critical role, rural or non-rural, in the health and well-being of the province, because we're the stewards of 80% of the landmass. And we're not just hewers of wood and drawers of water. We also do much more than that, that support the larger urban centers. So I think when the governments at other levels of government are looking at their center of gravities, population is one factor, but landmass, sustainability, the environment, impacts of climate change mitigation for 80% of the landmass of the province, that has to be a very significant counterbalance that they have to consider. They've got to keep the health of the small towns, rural or otherwise, because I think that carries the 80% of the population. So it's a very important lens that other levels of government have to look through.
Okay. Look, I wanted to ask you, Doug, you've been watching this carefully for your life, from what you've told us, and some smaller towns, however we want to define them, whatever it is to us, are thriving, and some are not thriving. What's the dividing line? What seems to work from your point of view, and what doesn't work?
Well, let me say a couple of things here. That there is a portion of luck that your location, for instance, to a place like Toronto. Collingwood, you're very fortunate. You got this mountain right beside you that you can draw off of. So some of it is a little bit of luck of placement, but anybody who knows me knows exactly what I'm going to say next, and it's vision. What separates, I think, small towns that are able to advance versus ones that can't is vision. And I think this is something that is really misunderstood and really not embraced to the degree that it has to be. You have to have someone or a group of people who can look ahead. And I'm here as an example. And there's one person referred to, Doug, that we know. The one thing that I would look at with our community is the four community. We can't do this alone. We can't do economic development. And I'm going to put it in the lens of economic development. We can't do it alone because none of us is big enough in and of ourselves to really garner the attention that we need to garner. But when you bring Midland, Penetang, Tiny, and Tay together into a group, then you're hitting a size that starts to hit the radar of some places. And what you start to do is you start to pool your resources, pool your, not just your money, but pool your land resources and start to put aside, to a certain extent, it's hard to do, but put aside some of your local independent biases and start to look at it as a group. That's the first step in a vision, to say, we can do better together. The second step is looking and understanding what you have and having the vision to be able to leverage off that. So in this area, we have the power of the four municipalities, but also the four key areas that we focus on for economic development, which is tourism, advanced manufacturing, agriculture, and healthcare. And being able to drive into those, pardon me, and leverage those four. So,
Brian, what do you think? What from your perspective, both being outside of government and in government now, you can name names or not, it's up to you, but what do you see as working? You can, what isn't working? I mean, are some smaller communities doomed to failure because they don't have that magic formula or luck or what you will? Or is it the vision thing, as Doug's just referred?
I agree with Doug. I think vision is absolutely essential. And there's the community-driven vision, and then I think there's a regional vision. We in this area of the, northwestern quadrant of Simcoe County have a boundary here with the Blue Mountains, which is very artificial for us because our regional tourism area goes right up the coast, up into Tobermory. So we've created a local mayors and CAOs forum consisting of town of Collingwood, town of Wasaga Beach, town of Clearview, the town of Blue Mountains, town of Grey Highlands, and the town of Meaford. So we're looking at working together on issues regionally, from economic development to transportation plans, managing traffic, healthcare, physician recruitment. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done regionally. And I think Doug's right that the insular look is not, I think, a progressive one. You have to look outside and work regionally with your neighbors. And I think as well, you've got to tap into your local resources. Collingwood does have a sense of place. We are at the base of the Niagara Escarpment and also between Wasaga Beach with the longest freshwater beach in the world. So I like to say we're the Oreo and we're the cream in the middle. So everyone goes for the cream first. But we attract the people from Toronto and beyond. And with them come some benefits in terms of business experiences, Doug was talking about, other perspectives, other backgrounds, as Ashley was referring to. And we had our first Pride Festival this year, and we have a Pride Crosswalk, and we're growing our theater. So these are all benefits of that diversity and of growth. So there are benefits to it. And I think that, but it has to, I guess, going back to my initial plan, it does go to planning. I mean, I think these things vision doesn't come as a lightning bolt frequently. It usually comes as a result of work. And so Collingwood is in trying to get more local businesses and gender employers for our younger group, where we have established an accelerator and we're investing in that annually. to look at growing local businesses with 5 or less employees, trying to double their size, and then trying to start local startups as well through a mentoring system and investment and finding seed funding for them. So these things, there are challenges, but there's a lot of opportunities. And I think through the visioning and the planning and working with your community, and there's an incredible resource in our communities. And I think probably small towns have to rely on that volunteerism and non-governmental influences in our communities play a huge role, because we don't have the bandwidth at town hall to try and accomplish all that. And really under the municipal legislation, we probably don't have that role, but we have that ability to tap into that. And there's another group up here called the Institute of South Georgian Bay that has some very creative and active minds that are influencing growth in our sustainability. They're advancing that agenda in our area here. So there's lots of opportunities when you're in the government level that's so close to the people as we are.
One of your comments actually gives rise to a question because you touched on it, and which I shared with the panel before this show, and it came from our audience to the MCC, and it's that small towns, especially rural houses, need better internet access to work from home. When will this happen? Or in essence, what is the problem? Why is it taking so long? I'd like you all to touch on that, because everyone seems to believe it's important. Yes, Ashley.
Yeah, I wanted to just touch on the economic development piece.
Okay, as you wish.
Before you went to Brian, but you must have missed me. But
I'm sorry, I did. I apologize.
So a few just observations based on what Doug and Brian were saying is that I am concerned at the rhetoric around rural development and growth, because growth has limits, and we tend to treat growth as if it's a universal positive, and it's not. And our notions of growth are almost entirely based in urbanization. So there's no successful rural development without becoming urbanized in our current conception of that. And we have to decouple those things. We have to decouple this idea of thriving and things being good from things always expanding and things becoming more urbanized in terms of character. There has to be a delinking of those concepts. And then I'd also, want to talk about this idea that contemporary economic development is broken. Like the reason we find ourselves in a lot of the messes that we're in terms of the encroachment of poor practices in technology platforms, the encroachment of poor corporate practices, the incentives we give to businesses to locate in a community or to be in a community in a certain way. None of the evidence in terms of the research, and I say this as someone who's worked on both sides, right? I've worked in this and now I study it. None of the evidence actually bears out that any of that works. It's essentially trickle-down economics with a nicer, friendlier face. And we know that if that was going to work, it would have worked sometime over the last 40 to 50 years, and it's not. So we have to be really conscious of when we talk about thriving, who do we mean? Who are we talking about? And who is this for? And I love a good rainbow sidewalk, and I can't speak on behalf of a person of color or a queer woman, but I can certainly say that like a rainbow sidewalk and having a seat at the table that represents me are vastly different realities. So it's a wonderful thing to have sort of these nominal touches to diversity or to economic diversification or to things around visioning. But if that vision isn't truly about changing power dynamics, changing the way we approach economics and how it influences our society, the way we prioritize people over profits, all of these kinds of conversations are really important to exactly what you were talking about, Brian, that visioning process, because who is that vision being created by and for? Who's represented in it? Who gets to have a say in terms of what that looks like will ultimately shape where that goes. So if you're coming from this assumption that the way things are, we just got to like dig down into it, that's how we should continue, it's a problem. And this applies to broadband. So I've spent more than 5 years working for the the Southwestern Integrated Fiber Technology Initiative. Broadband has been a big part of my file for most of my career. And our biggest problem with that is that we just keep throwing money at the same system without actually changing the system. So it is mind-bendingly silly to think that just throwing more money at large ISPs, and we're seeing this play out with the Rogers and Shaw merger discussions at the CRTC right now, that just sending billions of public dollars into private shareholder earnings is going to fix anything for rural communities, because the first thing that those large corporations hold hostage whenever they're challenged regulatory is rural broadband. They won't build it. So if you make me actually uphold lower prices, then I can't afford to build in a rural community. Like, are you kidding me? That's absolute nonsense. Instead of doing the hard work, which we need to do in the public sector and private sector and third sector, as was mentioned, is re-examine the way that we're doing those kinds of investments in infrastructure. If it is critical infrastructure, if the things we need to do are important, I would argue that that line around where we don't have the capacity or we don't have the bandwidth is largely a decision that we have made to not invest in building that capacity or really changing that landscape. So if it's something that's important to us, so when I go to a conference like the Ontario Good Roads Association, I get up there and I ask how many people have broadband on their official plan as a strategy, on their strategic plan, on their economic development plan, every hand shoots up. When I ask who has staff time and a budget line item actually devoted to building that infrastructure, maybe one or two hands go up. And so these are the kinds of decisions that we need to actually make in terms of where are we devoting our energy and our time and our resources, and are we actually putting them into the things that we say that matter, and how big is the gulf between what we say we value and what we do in practice? And I think that's what people are increasingly frustrated with.
I think that's the case. I think that's the case in almost everything you look at, right? That there's always an evolution. I will say when I was a teenager back in the 80s, there were still party lines out in Carling Township by Parry Sound. You know, that's an evolution that continues to occur, and it's the last mile, right? It's always the last mile that's the hardest mile and the most expensive mile. So, you know, those are things that have evolved over time. Pretty sure they.
I don't know if it's their irony that Doug is unfortunately breaking up when he's talking about broadband.
Yeah, super ironic.
We did not script it that way. Doug, are you back?
I hope I am.
Oh my goodness. No, we heard most of it, Doug, and you were really, you had a head of steam, but I'm sorry you broke up.
But we're talking about these types of things with broadband. Of course, you know, we're going to continue to push. We're going to continue to look for government to help to put the pressure, bring to bear. I mean, I run into the same problem in private business that there's only a certain amount of capital, there's only a certain amount of money, and you have to find a way to allocate it as best you can. So you do your best within the model because you can't be everything to everybody. And I do agree with you, Ashley, that when you're doing economic development, that's part of the vision is you know, the vision, for instance, here is not to pull in Hondas and Toyotas and these big 1,000-person plants. Right. That's not realistic. What we're looking at is those plants and those entrepreneurs that are, you know, anywhere between, you know, 2 or 3 up to maybe 50, 75 would be a big company to come into the area, because you're looking to build your economy in a certain way. You're not looking for certain types of companies. You are looking for other types, and you're trying to build around that type of growth to give the employment opportunity, to allow people to make a good living wage. If you rely just on tourism, you know, tourism jobs are traditionally lower paying jobs. So you're going to have that gap that one of the questions that came up had. You're going to have that earnings gap. That's why you need those companies coming in the middle to be able to fund and give more of a living wage. You know, companies like Lakeland Interiors or Maurice Mechanical that have a good number of employees, but they're very high skilled. It's a high skilled workforce doing a high skilled job and providing their product throughout, certainly throughout Ontario, and in some cases, I think outside of Ontario. So it's that type of thing. And when I talk about vision, Ashley, I talk the whole thing. So from a diversity standpoint, what are you encouraging? How are you doing things? To me, I agree with you, Ashley. It's more than just a rainbow sidewalk. That's a nice gesture, and it's important because it starts the conversation and it starts the ball rolling. But now, what are you doing around policy? What are you doing around gender washroom identification? What are you doing around those types of issues from a municipal standpoint, but even from a company standpoint? You know, are you making sure that people who are from the queer community are welcome in your company and aren't suffering from some kind of bullying or some kind of discrimination? Are your policies lined up accordingly? All of that starts with the vision. And as you pull the vision into reality, it's all of those types of policy decisions, all those types of ideas that start to be put forward to come to fruition.
Isn't there a great worry that in all of this talk about this evolution and whatever way we're going, and obviously whether communities can thrive, there's going to be a lot of have-nots that are going to get lost in this process? And what do we do about that? I see it on the streets of Midland every day.
Yeah,
people that are lost in this process, and that's not a criticism of anyone, but it's an issue.
No, we're definitely seeing that, and COVID has exacerbated that exponentially. Certainly in the Collingwood area, our housing prices were very, very high to begin with, and we have very low housing stock, and it's mostly single detached homes. So rental the vacancy rate is next to zero. So I think we are seeing those pressures, and I guess because we've been talking about bandwidth and the abilities of municipalities. Yeah, we do have to look at the tax scenario and then the sharing. If you take every dollar or $1 that a Canadian resident pays in taxes, 48 cents goes to the federal government, 44 cents goes to the provincial government, and 8 cents goes to the municipality. And with that, we have to maintain roads, we have to operate our facilities, we have to invest in capital management and pay for all the services from water treatment to wastewater to garbage. There's a very vast boots on the ground services that we provide to our residents. So, I think, Doug, at one point you mentioned if we could wave a wand, what would be the one thing we try to change in the municipal sector? And I think I would try to change the cost sharing arrangement at all three levels of government so that the municipalities have the ability to provide these services, to be that nimble, and to give meaning to all these important issues that are on our doorstep. We're the most immediate level of government, and we get calls every day from residents, and they don't care whose jurisdiction is. They have a problem and they need help. And this housing crisis and this equity and food insecurity is first and foremost amongst that.
And Ashley, did you just say hallelujah to that? And then Doug.
That used to be my line all the time. I've always been a local government evangelist because I've spent time in all three orders of government, and quite frankly, nothing is as satisfying as doing work that you actually get to see in front of you all the time. And that's why I love municipalities so very much. And that would be that you stole the words right out of my mouth, Brian, that if I have a Christmas wish or a magic wand, that would be one of the wishes. And maybe since you took that one, building on that, this conversation around haves and have-nots, and we see this I've done a lot of work in communities like Saugeen Shores, which has a lot of interesting benefits and challenges related to the growth of the nuclear energy industry, which is certainly what a lot of my dissertation is about. They're seeing this increasing stratification. And I think this comes down to, again, I would just poke at this idea around incrementalism isn't going to fix these broken models and markets. We have to actually just totally reconsider what that model and market looks like. And I think futzing about at the edges and saying, well, we have to work with it the way it is, when a lot of these choices, even just, for example, there is nothing in the Municipal Act that says that municipalities should write reports that are thou shalt and therefore to. There's nothing that requires that. How do we make the way we make decisions more transparent and easy for people to understand by using plain language? That's something that communities could do instantaneously. And that's just a very small example compared to all of the decisions that we could just, as we've seen through this pandemic, we can just choose differently. We can choose to prioritize different ways of working, being, and relating to each other. And I think a really important part of that is saying, we've been having these conversations for decades. When I tell people what my priorities are for a rural portfolio in the next election, it sounds so simple, right? Effective investments in infrastructure, affordable housing, food security, making sure that we're paying attention to gender-based violence, making sure that we're paying attention to those that are being left behind. It sounds just sort of okay, well, it can't be that simple, but we have more than 60 years of research that says that's what it takes. So let's do those things. We know what works. We just don't want to do them. And so part of this is this going back to this conversation around economic development is that for 5 years or 10 years, we told everybody if it's too expensive in the city, come move here. And now, surprise, surprise, we have a housing stock problem and an affordability problem in other communities that are within 90 minutes of Toronto. So we've effectively become virtual bedroom communities because nothing about the locus of social and economic power has moved. So when I talk about like this moving future and how we support these people that are being displaced by largely white collar workers who can work from home, who now are raising the cost of living in a lot of these communities, is that you have to be really purposeful, again, around who are we making decisions for? Who is this meant to support? And I think as we go forward from that, putting equity and justice at the center of all of our conversations rather than economics becomes the really important focus.
You know, always in these discussions, we touch the surface and there's so much to talk about, but I'm the wagon master. I have to wrap this up, according to my producer. And I'm sorry, I could have gone on for hours with all of you. You're great. But I'm giving you the last word, Ashley, and thank you.
You gotta let Doug chime in.
I'm out of time. Time waits for no man or woman. Anyway, my sincere thanks to all of our guests today, Brian Saunderson, Ashley Whedon, and Doug Ewen. Maybe we could do this again. And I thank you for your insights, but above all, your passion for preserving rural, small-town community culture, which you all show. My thanks also to Rogers, our producer, Ron Clark, and to our hardworking research coordinator, Gord McKay. Gord is a former mayor of Midland. He has a great passion for this topic, I can tell you. And finally, I want to again thank our season sponsor, Brampton Brick, whose support makes this program possible. Please join us for our next edition of Straight Talk in the new year, where the topic will be pricing ourselves out of house and home. And that came up tonight. Nothing provocative about that topic, but we're going that route. And for now, thank you for watching and stay safe.